In addition to Maija and myself, it's one of these things where we have this team that has just been incredible to work with. I mean, all of this sort of started with this almost snowball effect where Maija happened to be visiting our lab, and she expressed an interest in fish sounds, and the person that she was talking to said, "Oh yeah, Aaron does that." And then one thing led to another. We chatted for I think about 2 hours and said all sorts of stuff that we could do, and then bringing in a whole bunch of collaborative teams. So even though Maija and I are the ones presenting this stuff, we really want to acknowledge our key members of the research team from a variety of different institutions that have been instrumental in the work. I mean, the other thing that's exciting is that in addition to bringing together DEC, NYSWRI Point Environmental Center, we also have Patrick Baker from West Point and Surrey Safety now at Brooklyn College. And so it's this multi-PI, multi-institutional effort that has made it really exciting. So when we use terms like acoustic ecology and conservation, people may be familiar with this idea of the field more broadly of bioacoustics. And so this is the term that we have that's the study of animals that produce sound. So most intuitively, it's things like singing birds, but there's a wider variety of biodiversity that makes sounds, things like insects, think cicadas chorusing or buzzing in the summer. In the oceans, there's singing humpback whales. And then, near and dear to me are calling fish that fill coasts, rivers, and estuaries with sound. And so some of the commonalities that emerge out of this is that all of these animals are using sounds to call to attract mates, to defend resources. And even though these different species may sound differently, there's a lot of similar aspects that we can glean from studying their acoustic communication. Even though bioacoustics, like I said, seems like a remote or highly specialized field, I would argue that most of you have more experience listening to nature than you give yourself credit for. And what we have is this visualization of sound. So here's about a minute of sound from upstate New York in the summer. And this is a representation of sound that we call the spectrogram. So you read it sort of like you would music, where left to right is time, and then bottom to top is the frequency or the pitch of the sound. So low frequency is down here, higher frequency is up here. And what you begin to see, so we can try to listen to this first, but what you have are calling frogs. I don't know if people can hear that. All this stuff here. Stop it there. Later on in the recording, a car drives by. There's some unknown sounds that are likely a bird going over here. We have immediately identifiable 2 different or 3 different species of frogs. And so this is all, within a single minute recording, we're getting 4 species, a bunch of other things. The other thing that we can do is, given the sort of the loudness or what we call the receive level of the sound, we can also get an idea of how many individuals there are. Here's a bullfrog that's close. Here's one that's much farther away. And so in addition to species composition, we can get an estimate of numbers. And so you just received about a 2-minute crash course in this field of bioacoustics that we at Cornell teach over the course of about a year. There's a lot of things that you can do with this sound. Similarly, in addition to studying animals, as that passing car gave you an idea of, we can also study environments at sort of the landscape scale. So if you think of sort of a pristine sort of mountain ecosystem, with pastures and rivers, you might have some wind and birds and things calling in the forest, and that would sound extremely different from something like this, where you have an urbanized environment with lots of people, lots of cars, lots of noise, probably a lot fewer animals. And the same is true in aquatic ecosystems as well, whether that's something like a really nice beach where you might have some fish and some crustaceans, and comparing that to a really busy harbor with lots of ships and construction activity. So what we have is the ability to look at, with a single recording device, have the ability to look at individual animals as well as the ecosystems in which they live. And combining these 2 sort of ends of the continuum brings us to a field that has recently been referred to as acoustic ecology. And so this discipline of acoustic ecology, which has really gained traction within the last few years, involves several different types of questions, but all of them are revolving around this idea and trying to understand, how do animals use and respond to sound? How are changes in animal ecology identifiable through sound? What are noise influences on sound? How can we understand long-term changes? And so it goes from things at the organismal level, whether that's sort of hearing systems or sound production, all the way up through ecological patterns and human influences. And as you might imagine, and as shown by this schematic here, a lot of these things are interrelated to with each other as well. And so shifting from this overview of bioacoustics and acoustic ecology, we can turn our attention to things like underwater acoustics, where the vast majority of what we know about acoustic ecology is been primarily collected from oceans around the world. And this has really been driven by the mandate, usually by federal governments, to understand the occurrence of marine mammals around the world. Think dolphins, porpoises, a little bit seals. And the vast majority of bioacoustics work has really been done on coastal systems and the open ocean. In the last 5 or 10 years, we've had an emergence in some freshwater systems, but there's significantly less passive acoustic work done in freshwater habitats, and in particular, river systems. And so when we look at these bodies of water throughout New York, in places like New York Bight, the Great Lakes, the Hudson River, we have an extensive opportunity to take similar recording equipment and analytical approaches to understand the different ecosystem regimes, as well as the inhabitants within those habitats. So if we take the Hudson River as an ecosystem, in starting to work on this project with Maija, I really didn't have the appreciation for the large spatial extent of it as a habitat. Over 300 miles going from the Adirondacks and going out to sea around New York City. The fact that there are depths, merely inches deep, going to over 200 feet deep at World's End around West Point. I've also been blown away that the Hudson River has tides that are detectable along the extent of the entire river. So even up and around Albany and Troy, there are tidal cycles, which is really unique in a lot of freshwater habitats. And as with any sort of gradient or large-scale continuum of habitats, we have quite a bit of habitat diversity. So we have the main stem of the river, which is where most of the flowing water is, but we have tributaries from the mountains and creeks that drain into the Hudson. We have a variety of different wetlands. And then going from south to north is a decreasing salinity gradient, as with the lower harbor estuary emptying out in New York City, the salt wedge from the New York Bight and the lower harbor estuary extends many miles north into the southern extent of the Hudson. And so within this, we can't really think of the Hudson River necessarily as a single homogeneous habitat. Instead, what we have is a high diversity of habitats, likely each with their own soundscapes and different critters. And what makes it exciting for an animal ecologist like myself is the high biodiversity in Hudson River ecosystems as well. And so thinking about things that are either in contact with or underneath the water, we've got our fish, we've got our frogs, we've got invertebrates, and the occasional marine mammal that will wander upriver. I believe it was a gray seal that was identified around Albany or Troy many years ago. And so even though they're rare, they do occur in the river as well. And so with this large scale habitat and high biodiversity, there's a number of management needs that arise from this. And so this is where things like passive acoustics, or listening to ecosystems and animals, is well situated to assist with these management objectives. So we have things, ranging from protected species, such as sturgeon, that are both state and federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. We have a variety of different fisheries species, so think river herring or striped bass. We've got questions around ecosystem function. How do are the different habitats within the Hudson behaving? What drives them? How do they respond to change? We have increasing human influence, everything from the vast amount of vessel traffic that goes up and down the Hudson. We've got sedimentation due to construction activities and a bunch of other things. And of course, all of this is has the underpinning of climate change, no doubt, driving further impacts or accelerating other impacts to the Hudson systems. And within the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve has these different management sites where you can see in the map here, these 4 component sites plus the NYSWRI Point Environmental Center, where there's a significant amount of science going. And these sites have been used essentially as index sites to understand the ecosystems and biodiversity within the Hudson and how it may change along the extent of the Hudson. And all of these needs from a management perspective include science needs, think data gaps or better information to manage the species, as well as opportunity for education and outreach, which is one of Maija's specialties, and we'll talk about in a little bit. So we are not the first team to listen in the Hudson. There was a paper done in about 2008 or so, where in and around New York City, they dropped hydrophone off of Hudson in Manhattan, and then also record up in Tivoli Bay and get a variety of different sounds. Now, the challenge that we always face within underwater acoustics is trying to figure out which species makes which sounds. And so what you see in this depiction here on the right are a variety of different sound types that were collected based on what we know about animal sounds underwater that are most certainly biological. They're likely from fish, but in many cases, that's as far as we can get. And so then the question becomes like, okay, well, we have some aspect of biodiversity represented here, but it would really be more helpful if we knew which species made which sounds. And so with this effort was an enormous motivation to continue work many years later and expand the fact that, yes, there's absolutely biological sounds within the Hudson, and it's worth understanding more. So if we could take a step back for just a second, thinking about, if I'm telling you all, for some of you, this may be the first time that you've heard about the idea that fish make sounds, which you wouldn't be the first. Even there's fish biologists that have been studying fish for decades that still, when I talk to them at conferences or workshops, they're still confused or surprised when I tell them that acoustic communication is found in fishes. And so if we look at fish tree of life, so the challenge with studying fish is there's about 36,000 species of recognized fish, comprised, as shown here in this tree of life, are about 500 families. So up here you have things like sturgeon, down here you've got salmon, here's your catfish, cod are down here, and then a lot of the saltwater fish are up through here, and then things like sculpin up here. We went through the scientific literature with about 2,000 years of Western published history to understand and try to identify which of these groups may be making sounds. And so what I want to show you here is that on this family level depiction of the fish phylogeny, each of these blue dots represents where different fish have been documented to produce sounds. And so what the takeaway from this kind of representation is that sounds in fish are not just limited to a couple of few and random species, that perhaps the majority of fish, at least an overwhelming number, are relying on sound as key aspects of their life history, whether that's for attracting mates, defending territories, or other behavioral functions. And so with this context sort of in the background, what I like to do is take a fish species checklist like this, which is the number of fish species found in the Hudson River, going from the entire extent up to entirely fresh to entirely salt, and combine this with something that I showed you in the previous slide. And what you begin to see is something like this, where each of these green species boxes shows species that have been recorded in the past for which sounds may be available. But even more exciting, I can show you all of those species that belong to documented families that are producing sound. So the ones in blue may not have been recorded themselves, but they come from families that have been documented to produce sounds. And so rather than sort of a minority of fish species, there may be a significant number of fish found in the Hudson that we can try to listen for. The challenge then becomes, like I said earlier, trying to match which species make which sounds. And for some, it's easy, as you'll see shortly. And for others, it's significantly more difficult. But what this sort of depiction begins to show is there's an extensive amount of opportunity and things that we could explore through listening underwater. So what we've been doing is trying to address as a team several high-level research questions. So we've been doing this. I think we're in our fourth year. We started getting gear into the water just after things started reopening in the pandemic in 2020. And we started out with what are intuitively, relatively straightforward, conceptually simple questions, but have been proving challenging to try to answer. So thinking about what is the acoustic diversity and ecology of the Hudson River, trying to characterize which species make which sounds, being able to address key data gaps for species of interest, being able to look at human influence in fish calling activity, whether this is through things like dams and dam removal, or sources of noise like transportation, like ships and trains. And then there's the opportunity to understand how is the emergence of invasive species along the Hudson potentially impacting aquatic biodiversity. And as I'll show you a little bit later, invasive species could be other species of fish, or it could be invasive aquatic vegetation. What I want to focus on here for this presentation is sort of the first three bullet points, thinking about acoustic diversity and key species, but I'll touch on some of the other components later. And as always, happy to answer questions if they emerge. What we've been doing is recording along a fairly significant extent of the Hudson. So each of these blue dots on this map represent different recording locations that we've done. Some of these have been continuous, for some cases, 9 to 10 months a year. Some of these sites have been a little bit shorter in duration, the course of several days to several weeks. But what becomes exciting when we put it in context and thinking about superlatives is that this may represent sort of the longest stretch of river that's been continuously recorded, not only in North America, but possibly the world. And so, again, the spatial scale over which we're working is no small feat. And just to give you an idea of some of our sampling and what this begins to look like, it is that each of these locations, at a lot of them, we do have overlapping recordings, but we do sort of have a patchwork of different recording sites and time periods. Some of these are due to limitations on the availability of equipment. Some of it's due to favorable or unfavorable recording conditions. And then in some cases, like as you see with this, short sturgeon overwintering or Atlantic sturgeon spawning, which we'll get to in a second, these are for really, really specific questions. And so being able to mobilize particular recording units to answer those questions. And you might imagine that above and below the surface of the water, things sound very different. So from a recording at NYSWRI Point, what you see done at the same time, here's the hydrophone recording at a particular site. We see a storm coming through and we see a bunch of fish calls here. On a microphone above the surface of the water, that storm is still detectable, but we're picking up the emergence of sounds from birds and insects, as well as a frog chorus. And then a different sort of frequency scale representation helps accentuate both the fish calling here, as well as the bird and insect calling here in the lower frequency domains. And so even at a sort of overlapping location, the thing to realize and appreciate is that above and below the surface of the water often sound very different. Certainly for those people that have spent time on the Hudson, there's quite a bit of recreational and commercial boating activity. And not surprisingly, those passing ships make sounds. So here we have about a 5-minute sound recording, and you can clearly see about 3 or 4 passing ships. One here, you'll notice this sort of inflection right here. This is the sort of the closest point of arrival as that ship goes by. And another vessel here, and here. And as you would be recording for long periods of time and you're zooming out, you can imagine that human sounds are a fairly significant portion of this acoustic environment. From Patrick Baker's lab, since he is interested primarily in frogs. This is his favorite slide called Four Frogs in a Train, where you can see these different frogs that are calling, and then lo and behold, passing trains that are detectable on the side of the river, and being able to look at, do the frogs respond, in fact, to noises of trains. One of the priority species in the Hudson, particularly from the management and protected species perspective, like I mentioned earlier, are Atlantic sturgeon. And so sturgeon are an enormous and ancient species of fish. They're wide-ranging along the U.S. East Coast, from Canada down to Florida, and a subspecies into the Gulf of Mexico. They are anadromous, meaning they go up into fresh waters to spawn, and then will go out to sea as part of their life history, and they'll do those cycles every year. Over the past couple of centuries, sturgeon populations have really been hit hard by intense fishing pressure. And so those populations are a fraction in size of what they once were. And with the inception of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, Atlantic sturgeon were one of the first cohorts of species identified in need of protection. Sturgeon are currently managed as 5 distinct population segments, with the Hudson River distinct population segment being the largest of them. And so every year there are an enormous number of sturgeon, numbering in the hundreds to thousands of individuals that have the Hudson River as a key component of their life history, where they will return to particular sites year after year. Now, from the perspective of acoustics, where things get interesting is that even though Atlantic sturgeon themselves have never been recorded before, recorded to make sounds before, there's a number of other sturgeon species, perhaps half a dozen to a dozen, that have been documented to produce sounds, often described as a sort of a low-pitch thunder-like noise. And so even though we don't know the type of sound that we'd be looking for or listening for with Atlantic sturgeon, we do have an idea based on sounds from these other species. To make things a little bit more convincing, we can take our passive acoustic equipment, or our sort of underwater listening devices, and combine that with a number of other traditional fisheries sampling approaches, whether that's things like side scan sonar, work being done by Rich Pendleton and Amanda Higgs at New York DEC. They're doing telemetry, where we have tagged fish that are coming in, and then certainly animals collected through nets. Here we have a group of us and some students that are holding and posing with a freshly caught sturgeon before it gets tagged and re-released for tracking. And then here's a camera that Amanda had set up that shows a breaching sturgeon. So being able to take this corroborating data combined with being able to strategically place different recording devices allows us to sort of hone in on sounds that these animals might be producing, and understanding how they live and operate through this perspective of sound. So to give you an idea of what these recording devices look like, this is an example of one type that we use, but think something around the size of a water bottle or a soda can. It's filled with batteries. This little bit down here is the hydrophone. And then all of this is essentially a metal housing filled with batteries, and is sort of an implanted computer that does the recording. And these guys can record for about a month and a half. We've deployed other recorders that have deployed that can record continuously for about 5 months. And so, when these things come out, you can have literally weeks to months of sound to listen to. But since that becomes, prohibitive from the perspective of time, we have to rely on other types of analysis approaches. And we can put these things on the seafloor, or on the bottom of the river, or in the ocean on the seafloor, by having them anchored to some sort of device. Here we have them lashed to cinder blocks, which holds them nicely in place on the bottom of the Hudson. We only had a couple get swept downriver, but fortunately we have found them. But it provides a fairly reliable way to get a recorder in place for a long period of time, and then we can come back and get it. For Atlantic sturgeon, one of the key places that we've been recording is just south of the Poughkeepsie Yacht Club, which is right here. And this has been one of the documented Atlantic sturgeon spawning aggregation sites. So we put a recorder right here. And so with the idea that if you have a known site where sturgeon are occurring, we know that sounds are highly likely to be produced during reproductive activity. Essentially we're bringing the recorder to the fish, dropping in and keeping our fingers crossed that the fish that we're going after are in fact making sounds. And so sort of at our first pass, looking through the data, here we have that sort of spectrogram representation of sound going from about 0 to about 3,000 hertz. And this is 160 hours of sound. What you can see here, a lot of this is rain. So we get environmental noise. Here's some boats. I'll talk about this in a little bit. We get these freshwater drum choruses that go for several hours at night. And then in the low frequencies down here, we get what we think are Atlantic sturgeon sounds. So zooming in a little bit in time. So here we now have a couple minute long duration sound. Maybe this is a little bit less than a minute, where this green band right here is all freshwater drum. But then down here, these little red blobs are most certainly, or we think these putative Atlantic sturgeon rumbles. The thunder usually sound like. And so you can hear it's a little low frequency, maybe limited on certain people's speakers, but it's sort of like that low frequency rumbling noise. If you had a really good subwoofer, that might help, but we can share sounds later. But the idea is that these are a distinct sound that's likely not noise, and is associated with the fish. We weren't getting these sounds at other locations. So if we zoom in on this again in time, what we begin to see is something like this, with this sort of longer sound, with the this is the waveform, we have amplitude versus time here in the spectrogram down here, and a couple of other sounds from these spawning sites. And so getting deeper into the sounds, as I mentioned, that with an extensive duration of recordings, it becomes nearly impossible to listen to it all at once. And so one of the project leads, Rebecca Cohen, who's a postdoc in our lab, trained an artificial intelligence module that goes after, that teaches the computer how to automatically identify sturgeon sounds. And lo and behold, it actually ended up doing fairly well, such that we didn't have to go through the sounds. She was able to unleash one of these AI models on it, and it can label the sounds. What we began to see is, if we look at sort of the overall background noise, so this representation, it takes time out of the sound, but we're looking at how the loudness on the y-axis and the frequency on the x-axis. This red line represents the background noise. And then this blue line shows you the frequency and the distribution of frequencies when sturgeon are present and they're calling. We can characterize and measure different aspects of these sturgeon sounds. They're about 2 seconds long, about 43 hertz, so pretty low frequency, but still within the sort of human audible range. And again, one of the challenges in characterizing sounds or identifying them that they are biological is that we don't want them to be exactly the same, like a lot of mechanical noises from machines, but we don't want them to be all over the place. And so these show a level of variability that's consistent with other biological sounds, suggesting some degree of individual variation. So here's an example of measurements from sounds. What we can also then do is that, since we have a bunch of different recorders going continuously, we can start to look at temporal and spatial patterns. So this representation here, we have June of 2021 down on the y-axis here, going all the way up to the end of June or beginning of July up here. And then we have the time of day shown on the x-axis here. And each of these bars begins to show when and where are we getting sturgeon sounds. Based on the temporal patterns of when they're detected, they seem to have an increased level of activity at sunrise and sunset, but that calling activity does not drop off either in the middle of the day or at night. So they are throughout the day, but increases around sunrise and sunset. And of the 5 different sites that we have been working at trying to identify the occurrence of Atlantic sturgeon sounds, we're really only getting them around this Hyde Park monitoring site. So, if we were getting these low frequency thunder sounds at all these places, but the DEC fisheries team is not finding sturgeon here or there. It would seem that, wait a second, we're getting sounds that don't match where the sturgeon are being picked up. So the fact that the sounds are only coming from where the sturgeon are being identified is yet another piece of corroborating evidence that the sounds are from the species that we think and hope they are coming from. So this is work that's very much in progress. It's being able to continue to work with the DEC fisheries team and combine existing and ongoing corroborating data to increase the support that we're getting sounds from sturgeon. We're starting to work with folks from the New York Aquarium, where they have captive Atlantic sturgeon. And so the hope there would be, if you have a giant tank with nothing but sturgeon, and we put a recording device in it, and we're getting those same sounds that we're finding in the Hudson, that is pretty convincing evidence that, in fact, these are sounds from Atlantic sturgeon. And then what we would like to be able to do is that once we have these sounds that we're really confident about, is start to look at seasonal changes in calling activity. Do the acoustics show that sturgeon are spawning when we think they do? Or are they starting to spawn earlier than traditional or previous understanding? Do they have an extended spawning season? Is it shifting due to climate change? And then similarly, being able to use these kinds of approaches also on short-nosed sturgeon, which are a little bit farther north. And with efforts at recording at the short-nosed sturgeon overwintering site, I mean, again, my sort of underlying thinking is that if you have a whole bunch of fish, like thousands of fish that are just hanging out, and they come from families that make sounds, it seems to stand reason that there'd be a good chance that there would be biological sounds detected. And sure enough, at the short-nosed sturgeon overwintering site, we're getting some other sounds. These are a little bit higher frequency than we would expect, but there have been some sturgeon that do, in fact, produce higher frequency sounds. So things like this certainly warrant additional investigation, but you'll see sort of these different series of pulses that are occurring. And so again, we're not as conceptually far ahead with the short-nosed sturgeon as we are with the Atlantic sturgeon, but given the management needs and data gaps of short-nosed sturgeon, this is also a particular species of interest. I had mentioned freshwater drum. These were one of those species that we didn't really anticipate recording, but lo and behold, they're occurring in quite a bit of abundance, also at near that Atlantic sturgeon spawning area. So here is a spectrogram showing sort of these individual isolated calls. Their sounds almost sound like an upset stomach or some intestinal rumblings. It's kind of faint. But it's sort of this lower frequency groaning noise. And if you look at an extended spectrogram, here's when they're in sort of peak chorusing mode, and it's just sort of a nonstop buzzing of sounds. Let's see. It's a little bit faint. But for those of you that have been following the news story from last week on the mystery sound in Tampa, Florida, that lo and behold is being produced likely by black drum. Black drum, from what we know now, are the sister species of freshwater drum. And so, amusingly, with this, story of homeowners hearing weird sounds underwater, this is not the first time this has happened. There's been a number of cases, going back to the 50s and 60s, of weird sounds that people in waterfront houses are hearing that end up turning out to be fish sounds. And so the different drum species are certainly extremely loud. And as you see here, a fairly large part of the acoustic ecosystem. Since freshwater drum are an invasive species of the Hudson, they spread to the Hudson through the Erie Canal. One fundamental question becomes, with this chorusing activity, are they drowning out in acoustic space, or are they masking other native species of Hudson fish? Is there some degree of acoustic competition that's going on? And are they competing to be heard with each other? Here's another depiction of what some of these chorusing events look like. And from the perspective of the seasonal perspective, their calls are going from mid-afternoon to evening throughout late spring, throughout the summer. And we see similar patterns in Lake Erie and other places that they've been recorded. So being able to characterize multiple identifiable species within the spectrograms, and the acoustic data has been really exciting. Other fish species that we've been going after, and with work still in progress, in addition to the sturgeons, we have the river herring species, focusing on alewife and blueback herring. We've had recorders at Black Creek near one of the DEC fish weirs, trying to record as thousands of herring are being documented to move through a very shallow stretch of river. Those efforts haven't shown yet any identifiable sounds that we can associate with herring, but a recent group in and around Maryland documented river herring sounds in a watershed emptying into the Potomac, suggesting that there is some degree of sound. We may not just be listening in the right place. And in addition to freshwater drum, also being able to look at striped bass. So there are fall and spring aggregations of striped bass around the Troy Dam. Striped bass sounds, which have not been documented extensively. The only documentation occurs from work done in the 50s and 60s. But given both the management interest and the recreational fishing interest, seems to be another species that would be exciting to look at as well. So I had alluded, I've been focusing mostly on fish here, but alluded to aquatic vegetation. One of the efforts that we're in the process now of analyzing data from is being able to look at the influence of aquatic vegetation. So this is the same site at NYSWRI Point. Here's one of our recording devices here. This is the photo on the left is in May, before water chestnuts grow in the spring. And then this summer at the exact same location shows this water chestnut meadow as the vegetation grows in later in the summer. And so you can see there's a profound change due to invasive vegetation that will most certainly change the habitat structure and potentially create hypoxic conditions. And what we'd like to know is there an impact on the soundscape, or can we detect changes in the fish community due to the increase in submerged aquatic vegetation? So, similarly here, there's a number of different questions that we can explore all through these single types of recording devices. And then, lastly, working with Chris Bowser and Maija at NYSWRI Point has been really exciting because of the extensive work that the Hudson River Estuary Program has been doing outreach and education around sturgeon. So, being able to bring sounds or sound exhibits or displays to ongoing sturgeon activities where you can have, little kids interested in sturgeon being able to learn that fish too make sounds is a really great opportunity to sort of to help educate the public. And then additionally, we've been taking advantage of the resources and existing programs at NYSWRI Point to conduct workshops and stakeholder meetings, not only on ecosystem changes in the Hudson, but identifying if and how passive acoustic approaches may be useful for understanding changes in the Hudson, and use it as a way to help people create sort of a better experiential connection with the Hudson River. One of the things that we're working on and would like to do is to create an interactive kiosk at NYSWRI Point, where people can sort of look at and see and listen to different types of sounds, and then being able to have a hydrophone that extends from the environmental center out into the middle of the Hudson, where people can look at the soundscape in real time as it is in front of them. So a number of different things that we can do with the number of teachers and school groups that are coming through NYSWRI Point as well. There's an opportunity to bring curricula centered around underwater acoustics, fish behavior, and climate change through acoustics to these groups as well. So a lot of the opportunity to be able to take the basic and applied science research and immediately translate it into sort of an educational format. So with that, certainly want to thank our collaborators providing tremendous logistical support. Our funding sources, certainly we've had ongoing support from the New York State Water Resources Institute that without that support, none of this would have been possible. And that's led to a large grant from NOAA and the National Estuarine Research Reserve System and their Science Collaborative Program.